The 20th century saw the collapse of the European-dominated world order and the dawn of what came to be known as the American century. Rising to lead the world out of the ashes of World War II, the United States faced off against the Soviet Union in a dual superpower struggle for the ideological future of the world, in a Cold War that very nearly ended all life on the planet. The dawn of the 21st century saw resurgent Russia, eager to reclaim its top spot among the world powers, and the mighty Chinese dragon at long last waking up from its slumber. But as we start the second decade of the 21st century, who is truly the top dog? Who is the world's superpower in 2021? A superpower is defined as a nation that can exert its influence globally, including military and diplomatic power. However, as the Cold War showed us, there are many more factors that make up a superpower, and that can determine its success, or in the case of the Soviet Union, its bitter failure. Military power is an obvious measure of a superpower's capabilities. In modern times, for a nation to rank as a superpower, it must be able to fight major conflicts in all four regions simultaneously: land, sea, air, and space. Many nations today seem to fulfill this criteria, but there's a difference between being able to fight and win a series of pitched battles and a superpower's capability for a prolonged campaign lasting many months or even years. Britain, for instance, has the capabilities to fight across all warfighting realms and was even able to successfully prosecute a short war against Argentina all the way across the world. However, this was very nearly a disastrous campaign for Britain, saved only by sheer luck, excellent on-the-ground commanders, and a demoralized enemy. Even just getting to the battlefield in the South Atlantic safely was a challenge for England, and it secretly relied heavily on the United States for logistical and intelligence support. Clearly, these capabilities are far behind those of a superpower, able to prosecute a war far from its own shores with no outside help. The ability to wield political power globally is another qualification for being a superpower. A common misconception names Rome as the ancient superpower, and yet against this measure, Rome ranks merely as a regional power. There was very little Caesar could do to influence politics in China, for example. A superpower must wield enough political leverage that it can influence the politics of any region, no mean feat considering the very different issues facing each region of the world. Basically, a superpower needs to have its finger in every single pie out there, which hedges out most nations in the world from superpower status. Next is technological power. A superpower must be a center of innovation and lead the way in a large number, though not all, areas of scientific breakthrough. During the days of the Cold War, it was relatively easy for the US and Soviet Union to remain sole technological superpowers, but the decentralized nature of our world today actually makes achieving technological hegemony extremely difficult, if not impossible. Even minor powers can find themselves leaders in key technological areas of expertise, and the ever-quickening pace of technological development makes it even harder for any one state to claim technological supremacy. Economic power is an obvious measure of superpowerdom. After all, money does indeed make the world go round. During the Cold War, the United States was the inferior military power to the Soviet Union, and yet it was many times superior economically. The US's massive economic clout allowed it to take the forefront in many international institutions, and along with it, its political power led to the US encircling the Soviet Union with states friendly to itself, and hostile or at least ambivalent to the Soviets. Lastly, there's the least obvious measure of superpowerdom that is often overlooked, and yet it is even more important than military, political, or even economic power, and that is cultural power. In fact, cultural power often paves the way for the expansion of political and economic power, and yet is the one area of dominance that's overlooked the most. After all, it's easy to measure the impact of a fleet of aircraft carriers, but a lot more difficult to measure the global impact of a nation's film and television industry. So out of these four categories, who wields enough influence to be the world's superpower? Or is there more than one? Militarily speaking, the three strongest nations in the world are, in order, the United States, Russia, and China. The United States fields a total military, including reservists, of 2,245,500 personnel. Russia's military numbers at 3.5 million and China at 3.355 million. At first glance, it would seem the US is outmatched in military power, but manpower alone is only part of the equation in a modern war. Power projection is the ability to put steel on target no matter where in the world that target happens to be, and something that Russia and China, despite their great military power, struggle with greatly. While both China and Russia have strong air forces, what they fundamentally lack is strong blue water navies, or navies with the capability to support long-term combat operations far from shore. Russia's navy is all but hopeless in this regard. with only a single aircraft carrier which is in terrible disrepair and had to be called back home from combat ops in Syria due to maintenance issues. China fares slightly better with 2 aircraft carriers, though their designs greatly limit the payload and range of launched fighters. What truly hounds both navies, however, is the lack of a robust logistics fleet. Ships, after all, can't stray far from home unless they can be refueled and rearmed. Currently, the U.S. Navy maintains the largest logistics fleet in the world, giving it global reach and the ability to move thousands of troops safely to any hostile beach on Earth and land them there. However, China has undertaken great efforts to modernize and expand its fleet and currently outnumbers the U.S. Navy. That might be alarming to some, but the U.S. still retains a substantial advantage over the Chinese Navy. While the Chinese field more ships, and some ships which are more capable than even American ships of the same class, U.S. firepower dwarfs the Chinese Navy's, with 9 times more vertical launch missile cells across its ships than the People's Liberation Army Navy. The American attack submarine fleet is also far more capable than the Chinese fleet, and as they're all nuclear-powered, have far greater endurance than the Chinese fleet, which only has 7 nuclear-powered submarines. China, however, is not standing still and might outgun the U.S. by as much as 100 ships by the mid-2030s. For now, though, the United States Navy retains America's spot as a global superpower, and due to their inability to conduct combat operations far from home, both China and Russia fail to meet that criteria. What about in the political and economic arena, however? Who reigns supreme here? Russia still remains a significant global power in both these arenas. But with a shrinking economy and a population in decline since the fall of the Soviet Union, its influence has dramatically shrunk since the Soviet Union heydays. Russia has one major problem. Well, 2 really. The first is a lack of a truly diversified economy. When the US and the EU levied sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Crimea in 2014, the detrimental effect on the Russian economy was compounded by Russia's heavy reliance on fossil fuels for its economy. As oil prices have dropped repeatedly over the last 20 years, the Russian economy has suffered greatly for it, to the point that when it's not even in active decline, the Russian economy sputters along at barely 1% growth every year. Compare that with China's impressive growth of nearly 10% a year starting in 1978, slowing to about 6% since 2015, an absolutely astounding figure. There can be little doubt that China is today an economic superpower. China's nominal gross domestic product is $16,806.5 billion versus the United States' $23,059.65 billion. In 2020, China overcame the US as the world's largest economy at $24.2 trillion versus the US's $20.8 trillion. Yet these figures don't quite tell the whole picture, as the IMF still ranks China as a developing nation with over 300 million living on less than $5.50 a day. In terms of personal wealth, U.S. citizens have on average 6 times greater wealth. On the road to superpowerdom, though, China faces an imminent and potentially catastrophic hurdle. Chinese household debt is ballooning to over 50% of national GDP, with a total debt at 318% GDP, versus the U.S.'s also not great 100% of national GDP. Household debt is of specific concern as it limits consumer activity, something any economy relies on heavily, but is especially catastrophic to China, which is still struggling to lift many millions above the poverty line. To add fuel to the fire is a looming population crisis, as China's one-child policy enacted in 1979 comes home to roost. As people live longer, China's retiree population is growing and will very soon place a massive economic burden on a working-age population that's shrinking in comparison thanks to low birth rates. Despite many incentives to encourage women to have more children, China's birth rates continue to plummet, spelling serious economic troubles in the decades to come. China isn't alone in economic woes, however, and after the coronavirus crisis, the US finally hit 100% of GDP in debt. While this is 3 times less than China's debt, there are serious concerns about US overspending and the strain on global relations should those debts continue to balloon. Some fear a global superpower debt crisis, with both the US and China becoming buried under mountains of debt. Both the US and China are nearly equal competitors in the economic arena. Though the US's global military influence gives it a political reach, China just barely falls short of. In these 2 arenas, though, both nations fulfill the requirement of a global superpower. Lastly, what about the cultural arena? There have been many proposals as to why the US won the Cold War, but the clearest indicator of who would be the victor was when the Soviet teens started buying Pepsi and wearing Levi jeans, at least those who could get their hands on them. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union's greatest failure wasn't in building a strong economy, dominating technological breakthroughs, or fielding a powerful military. It was failing at making non-Soviets want to be Soviets. The US, on the other hand, basically invented cool, and then mass exported it around the world until everyone wanted to dress American, listen to American music, and watch American movies. It's been said that you can't fight an enemy you've become or aspire to be, and no cultural force in Earth's history has been greater than that of the United States. Today, Russia cannot compete internationally in the cultural arena, and China too has realized its own shortcomings. Xi Jinping has seen cultural influence as so vital to overthrowing the United States as a global power that he's invested heavily in the nation's film industry. The Chinese international box office is steadily growing, and in a direct attack on the US, China has moved to become a major economic partner in American studios and theater chains, working to influence American filmmaking toward Chinese ends. China's global influence, however, remains largely limited to its economic sector, as Chinese culture struggles to create or define any global trends against deeply entrenched American culture. Despite the world's most popular app, TikTok, being Chinese-owned, international strategy sessions called for the app to cater to American social media stars in order to successfully grow internationally. Today, China struggles to create its own cool, while the United States continues to define the global standard for pop culture. This disparity in cultural power is perhaps best illustrated by China's continued problem in creating American Chinese instead of more Chinese Americans. Today, there's as many as 100,000 Americans living in China versus 2.5 million Chinese who call America home. In the end, China's authoritarianism, censorship, lack of democratic values, and a continued genocide against religious minorities all works to turn the world off from Chinese culture, leaving the US as the sole global cultural superpower. While China and Russia come close in many areas of competition or even match the US, it's America who remains 2021's sole superpower, with the ability to fight wars anywhere on Earth, influence regional politics on a global level, and exert its influence on every culture on the planet. The United States remains Earth's only superpower. Some analysts, in fact, consider the United States a hyperpower, outstripping even a superpower in capabilities, though this is up to some debate. What is clear, however, is that the United States faces very stiff competition with a growing China, and 100 years from now, there's no telling who will rule supreme. Now go watch China versus the United States. Who would win? While China still hasn't blocked YouTube in your country, or click this other video instead.